Okay, you guys are going to go ahead and. You can just both sit here, and I'll give you a clicker. And this will be in reverse. So you just turn both of those on. There you go.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're both on here. And it looks like we are the last two between you and lunch, so we will try to do our best to get you out of here on time. Chad and I are here to talk to you today about the challenges we faced in the SMA support office. You'll hear me use the term SSO for that office, as we provided software assurance support to the commercial crew program. I would like to say that we are speaking for our office, not for the commercial crew program. We will be sharing the experiences we had in providing support to that program. And obviously, and we're providing solutions to challenges, those are located within our office. The program had its own challenges, some of which will overlap, but we're going to talk about the solutions that we had within our office. Okay. Good. I can do that from here. Okay, so first we'll start off by talking about giving you an overview of the program, just so we all have sort of a common ground of the basis of where we're coming from. We'll talk about the support we provided to the commercial crew program. We'll talk about the challenges, and hopefully there'll be time at the end for questions. If we do happen to run out of time, you can catch either Chad or I while you're here for the workshop, or for those of you local, we're in Building 1, so feel free to drop by and ask any questions you might have. Okay, so first and foremost, what is the commercial crew program? Most of you may be aware that NASA has chosen to contract with commercial providers to deliver cargo, goods, if you will, to the International Space Station. And then also return maybe garbage and burn up in the atmosphere, or perhaps return the results of science experiments back to Earth. Commercial crew is the next iteration of that type of a program, only there's a lot more risk and a lot more safety factors that have to be considered when we start putting people on those commercially provided systems. NASA will not own the system, NASA will not own the software. I've heard it very simplistically put as NASA's buying a ride in a taxi. I would like to say that, as an aside, NASA has a lot more to say in what's going into that taxi before they start putting their astronauts on it to get them to the space station. The program is managed out of Kennedy Space Center with support from around the agency. Obviously, they have contacted the IV&V program for some support in terms of software assurance. There are representatives from Johnson Space Center, Marshall Space Flight Center, as well as other subject matter experts from around the agency. So it is an agency-wide program, but it is run out of Kennedy Space Center. It is a highly visible program. Most of you know that when the shuttle program ended a few years back, NASA lost the capability to put humans into space from the United States, from our own soil. That was something we were very proud of, and we'd like to have that capability back. And when it comes to transporting personnel to the International Space Station and then returning them home safely, they've chosen to go the route of contracting with commercial providers to provide that transportation service. We all know that within NASA, there is a manned program going on, MPCV and SLS, but that is beyond the International Space Station. And so for transport from Earth to the station and back to Earth again, they're working with commercial providers. And that's what commercial crew is all about. Obviously, regaining that is a lot of attention across the agency as well as around the country. You'll see a lot of things in the media as decisions are made with regard to the commercial crew program. The program has multiple program phases, which sort of align with what you might think of as a typical NASA program. You start with a concept and go through some phases, some development, design, integration, some tests, and come out the end with a system that hopefully meets the requirements that you started with. I mean, that was sort of the whole plan. The difference with commercial crew is that each of those phases is run under a different type of contract vehicle. Some are run under Space Act agreements, some are run under formal contracts. Each of those types of agreements have their own rules, both for the acquirer, for NASA, as well as for the provider. So there's a little difference there in that at the end of each phase, there's typically a new RFP and a new agreement put in place. So it's not like you start at the beginning and you have your agreement in place all the way through delivery, of the end system. Commercial crew changes throughout, and that also opens the door for down select of the providers. Typically, you'll see in the next few slides when I talk about the different phases of the program, you'll see how the number of providers as well as the contract vehicles change. The last slide here, excuse me while I put my readers on so I can see the small print. The non-traditional approach, that's something that is very unique to commercial crew and something we have had to do. We at IV&V and the IV&V program know that we have to adapt a lot. For commercial crew, our small team also had to do a lot of adapting because this is a very unique program. The typical set of requirements that NASA might levy on a program were not levied on commercial crew. They chose to split the requirements into sort of what was to be delivered and how it was to be delivered. They refrained from levying the how the work was to be done on the providers. These are commercial companies. They have their own efficiencies. They have their own processes, their own methods. And the end goal is to have a low cost, or at least a reduced cost for NASA, a transportation system that is high quality, that is safe, and that NASA is agreeable to any residual risk that remains in those systems before putting astronauts on them to send them to the space station. So the companies are using their own, bringing some of their own funds as well as the NASA funding, but it is a reduced set of requirements that are levied on the providers, mostly on the what and not the how it will be done. So one of our challenges, as you'll see, is that they didn't do things necessarily the NASA way. And then we still have to do our own analysis. We still have to do our assessments on something that doesn't look like what we've been used to looking at in the past. The whole point, obviously, of getting cost reduction and getting the end goal would be more than one transportation provider. There's more than one for commercial cargo, would be that NASA would have options when these systems are fully developed. Again, low cost and redundancy in the availability of this transportation service. Okay, so the next few slides, I'm going to try to get through these quickly and leave plenty of time for Chad to talk here at the end as we get into the challenges section. But the point of these slides is to show you the phases that the commercial crew program has gone through. These first two development phases, you'll notice we'll start with the calendar on the left, the number of providers who are participating in that phase in the center, the type of contract and the purpose is on the right. We were not involved in either of these two development phases, but you will notice here that both of these were run under Space Act agreements. I like to think of the Space Act agreement as much more of a partnering and an information sharing type agreement. One of the things NASA wants to make sure is that these commercial providers don't repeat mistakes. They take advantage of the lessons that NASA has learned over doing human-rated systems and human-rated missions over time. But you'll notice in the center that for CCDEV1 there were 5 providers. Those are NASA-funded providers. At the bottom, it looks like there was an increase in the number of providers. However, there were only 4 who received funding from NASA. The other 3 continued their work, but under their own funding resource. The next 2 phases, and this is where SSO came in and started providing services. CCICAP, the integrated capability phase, was already going on when they asked us to come on board and provide some software assurance support. And then we were there for both of what we like to call the subphases of CPC. There was an initial delivery of documents, and then there was a final delivery of documents. You'll notice that CCICAP was run under a Space Act agreement, so we were allowed to give more guidance and advice and sharing of information. CPC was much more of a contract vehicle, where we were giving a little advice, but much more of sort of, someone once called it, grading the final product. We got what was delivered to us, we provided results back to them, but much less advice on how to make that product better. That was just the nature of the contract of the vehicle. In this case, one was a Space Act agreement, and one was a contract agreement. And you'll see that the benefit for us, we had the same 3 providers, both through CCICAP and CPC. So we weren't worried about changing providers and dealing with different personalities and different companies and different types of deliverables. Once we got used to one set of 3 providers, we were using the same 3 providers, working with the same 3 providers in the CPC phase. And the final phase, which I believe will be the final phase, as of today, there has not been a contract or contracts awarded for CCTCAP. We will be supporting this phase, and we're preparing to do that Interestingly enough, again, we don't know if there will be one provider we'll be supporting or if there will be two providers that we'll be doing analysis for. This again will be a contract type phase. Demonstration flights we are expected to perhaps begin in 2016. The end result obviously would be the transportation systems that NASA would have, hopefully more than one, would be the goal. We do know that we are expecting less than 3, which is, we've been working with 3 up to now. We do expect that funding will limit that to less than 3. Personally, I think for us and for NASA, they'd like to see more than 1, but we won't know that until the contracts are awarded. This contract, for anyone who happens to deal with contracts, is a FAR-based contract, and it is a firm fixed price contract. So the rules will be a little different again in working under that contract, both on the acquirer, and the provider. So where did SSO come into this? I've talked a little bit about the phases, but this diagram is a very simple diagram that shows an overall view of the organization for the commercial crew program. One little tidbit I want to throw out here, you'll notice there's a box that says FAA on this chart. The reason that FAA is on this chart is that these will be commercial launches. Unlike the typical NASA launch, the FAA is responsible for public safety if it's a commercial launch. So that piece, the public safety piece, falls into the realm of the FAA for the commercial crew program. And NASA and the commercial crew program, NASA's commercial crew program and the FAA are still having conversations about how do they work out that relationship. That has not been fully defined, but it is definitely an area of conversation right now. Because within the commercial crew program, the Safety and Mission Assurance, or SMA organization, is not large. It is much smaller than that which supported shuttle. They had to sort of pick and choose where are they going to get their best return on investment, where do they need to focus their efforts. The focus they chose was on crew safety. These are commercial systems, but it is NASA personnel, typically NASA astronauts, maybe some from other agencies, but typically NASA astronauts who will be on these systems. So the focus for commercial crew in terms of safety and mission assurance is on crew safety. SSO, as you can see, is tied into 2 boxes here at the bottom. If you recall, for CCICAP and CPC, there were 3 providers. Each of those providers had an integration team, or a PIT, a partner integration team, that was the primary interface to each of those. So each provider had a partner integration team. And either directly or indirectly, our analysis results were fed back through those interface teams back to the individual partners. However, our primary interface, for most of the time, for our results were to one person who was responsible for software safety in the CCP Safety and Mission Assurance Office. So we had one point of contact. It was very nice to just have one person we had to work with, and all of our results funneled through that one person. However, if you think about 3 providers and all the documentation, most of you have done some type of analysis, the documentation is going to come through. To have one person responsible for software safety was a little bit overwhelming. So the commercial crew program and the IV&V program had a conversation, and the SMA support office, or SSO, was allowed to bring some resources to bear to support him. And as you'll see on this next slide, we were asked to provide what we called reachback support. Again, our focus was on crew safety, but our expertise here is in the area of software. So we were looking at the software elements in the system. Our primary areas were twofold. Hazard reports. Again, we did not look at all of the hazard reports. We looked at the hazard reports that either did or should or could have a software element in them. That was Chad's area of expertise. So if you've got a question about hazard reports, I'm going to defer you to Chad. My focus area was more in the area of alternate standards, which was, again, a new concept for NASA. In levying requirements on the providers, they said what must be done. But you know, NASA has standards and NASA has NPRs, or NASA procedural requirements. It's the way NASA does things. They much more were looking at the standards. That's what was levied on the providers, much less the NPRs, which specifically the requirements in the NPRs that were how it was to be done. One of the things that the commercial crew program allowed for a certain subset of those standards, those levied requirements documents, was that the providers could determine that they had an equivalent to the NASA standard, and they could submit that to NASA for assessment and approval. Now, our area, we focused on software engineering, software assurance, software safety, and there were a subset of the models and SIMS standard requirements that were levied on the providers. Those were the areas that we looked at, particularly in the area of alternate standards. You'll see some of the challenges that came along with that when I talk about the first of the series of challenges that we're going to share with you today. But that was something brand new. There were no methods, there were no procedures, they'd never done this before. NASA had never done this before, so we had to figure out what does it mean to assess an alternate standard. The other areas where we provided support, we did some support in the areas of verification reviews, in the areas of supporting review boards, and if you want to know about week-long review boards, week after week after week, you can ask Chad. He was on the phone late nights, long hours, but provided excellent support as we got from the feedback from the program. We also supported any other ad hoc requests that came in to the safety assurance point, our point of contact, the safety assurance person within the SNMA organization inside of CCP. Essentially, if he received an assignment, a document to review, so did we. We were his reachback support to make sure that he could accomplish the requests and the analysis he was asked to perform. I talked about already the phases that we supported. We've already supported CCI-CAP. We completed CPC just recently, and we are gearing up to support CCT-CAP. And the last point was the amount of effort, the amount of work, typically measured in findings or comments. We don't call them specifically issues as most of the IV&V folks here do. Because under commercial crew, these are commercial companies. They can choose to address the comments or not address the comments. It's really up to them. So we typically label them comments or findings, or in general feedback. We generated roughly, through CCI-CAP, the portions that we supported in CPC, roughly 700 comments. At one point, that was deemed 1/3 of the CCP, Safety and Mission Assurance comments that were generated for CCP. So we actually had a visit from some folks from the program who came up to thank us for the amount of effort that we put in. And you'll notice our acceptance rate was 99%. I will caveat that by saying that is at the program level, that is at the CCP level. When we submitted our comments through our point of contact, our acceptance rate was 99%. We would have loved to have found out what the providers thought. We got some feedback, particularly in the CCI-CAP phase when there was a lot more dialogue and conversation and sharing. But because we were not the only ones looking at the documents that we were assessing, all of the CCP personnel who were looking at those documents, those comments were collected, collated, merged, melded, changed, and so somewhere in there our comments existed, but then they went through a series of review boards before they ever got to the provider. As you can imagine, it's very difficult to figure out, track your acceptance rate and track your comments through those review boards, many of which we didn't have insight into and which we didn't participate in those reviews. So we chose to measure ourselves at where we knew we could get feedback, and that was at the CCP, at the program level. So that's why our number is 99%. Okay, what you're really here to hear about, the challenges that we faced. I'm going to give you a quick overview. I'm going to talk about the first one, and then you can stop listening to me and you can listen to Chad right up until lunchtime. All right, so our first one, you can imagine what the first one is. We're dealing with multiple providers at the same time. We are analyzing 3 different commercial companies' work at the same time. It's like analyzing 3 different projects. They're doing the same work, and you're looking at them at the same time. So as a person, as well as in our repository, we've got to keep all that information straight. Not only do we have to keep it straight, but we can't cross-pollinate. Just because provider 1 has a great way of doing something, you can't share that with provider 2 or provider 3. You have to keep it all straight and separate. That includes your comments on teleconferences and in review boards, as well as in your analysis documentation. Multiple contract vehicles with multiple rules. Are we providing guidance? Are we providing help? Or are we just grading the final product? Multiple phases going on at the same time. Not only do you have to keep straight what type of agreement you're working under, but as I mentioned, CCI-CAP and CPC were going on at the same time. Sometimes we got the same documents. Sometimes we got different documents, different versions. So you have to keep that straight. Multiple NASA stakeholders. Not only were we working with CCP, who's working on a human-rated system, but we've got MPCV and SLS going on over here. They also have objectives for human-rated missions and systems, so we've got to kind of keep that in mind as we're doing our analysis. And then the one that I guess you could call this one near and dear to my heart is the whole atypical approach, not only taken by the program, which I've already hinted at, but also by the way the providers responded to the different agreements throughout the different phases. So let's talk about the first one. The first one is the whole atypical approach. The atypical approach, we've talked about the unique way that the NASA and the Commercial Crew Program chose to levy requirements on the providers. They were specifying what was to be delivered, not how it was to be delivered. So from an analyst perspective, when you're looking at things and you're used to seeing certain types of documents or things formatted a certain way or requirements in a certain way, you may or may not get that because they're not doing it the same way. These are leading edge companies for the most part that are going to be doing things new and different. So you have to adapt what you're used to seeing. The alternates that were allowed to NASA standards, again, no methodology for that. We asked the program, we said, great, we can do this. Do you have any guidance? Do you have any ideas about how this is to be done? And essentially they said no. So we had to come up with something brand new. There were waivers, which is not unusual for NASA programs. Waivers were allowed for either a set of requirements, a small subset of requirements, or even individual requirements. However, for the software areas which we were focused, again, software engineering, software safety, software assurance, and a subset of models and sims, there were no approved waivers that came through from the providers. Had there been an approved waiver, it would have only applied to the provider who submitted the waiver. It would not have gone across the board to all participants at that life cycle phase. Providers are, again, unique. They have their own way of doing things. We had everything from a company who had worked with NASA for years to one who had never worked with NASA, and we had issues with communication, acronyms that they didn't understand that we tend to use every day, wording that we were asking for, concepts that we were asking for that they didn't work that way. They just did things differently, and so we had to adapt. So now we've got the program and we've got this set of providers, and they're all doing things a little differently than what we're used to. So how did we adapt? What did we do within the SMA support office to address that? Well, first and foremost, we decided that we had to divorce ourselves from how the work was being done and what we were getting. When I talked about alternate standards, the option could be an industry standard, it could be a standard that the provider created on their own, or what we typically got was a whole stack of documents. Here's my development plan, my management plan, my risk management plan, my safety plan. You can imagine it was a whole stack of documents. This is how I do engineering. This is how I do assurance. This is how I do safety. Here, NASA, you figure out, we're going to submit that as an alternate to the standards that you say we have to meet. Now we've got to figure out how to assess that. So what we chose to do was map what they were doing and based on the documentation we received to the goals and objectives, the whole meeting the intent idea that NASA was expecting. For us, there were others in the agency who did this differently. Our option was to do that at the requirement level. So we created a spreadsheet. You've heard about spreadsheets for how many days now? Everybody uses a spreadsheet, but it was the easiest tool we had, and it was where we chose to start. We put all those requirements in a column in a spreadsheet. We did a little research to try to figure out why is it NASA cares about these requirements? What is the intent of this requirement? Why is NASA going to levy this on a provider in the first place? What's the rationale? And I went, oh, rationale. I happen to be a member of the team who created the software engineering handbook. So I knew that for the software engineering requirement set, there was already NASA Office of the Chief Engineer approved rationale, intent, why is this here? That already existed. That was great. We had a little more work to do for assurance and safety in some of the other areas, but we were able to come up with some rationale for why NASA cared about that requirement. What were they looking for? We took that and converted it then into a set of evaluation criteria, which, for lack of a better word, was a series of questions. What are we going to be asking ourselves, and what are we going to be looking for in the artifacts that we got, whether it was a single document or whether it was a whole stack of documents? Once we had the requirements, once we had that set of evaluation criteria, we prioritized what we were going to look at. For those of you who've dealt with any of the NASA standards, you know there are standards levied on NASA centers. There are requirements, levied on OCE, the Office of Chief Engineer, perhaps some on OSMA. You're never going to levy those on a provider. So automatically that set of requirements became out of scope. We didn't have to look at those. The next thing we did was to prioritize. We decided that anything that was focused on crew safety or that was related to risk became primary. Those were the primary requirements. We really had to do a good job and focus on those. That didn't mean we left everything else out. It just became secondary. And when we had time, obviously, we looked at all of those. When I think of secondary, I think of things like schedules and cost estimation. Those are important to getting your project done. But in a commercial environment like this, that's more on the provider than it is on NASA. And it's much more on them to make sure those things are handled. And there's a little less effect on the crew safety in those areas. So we sort of had to make a dividing line there. We did go through all of those with our point of contact in the CCP SMA office, our software safety person, and he agreed with us, even helped change some of those priorities based on what he knew was coming out of the program. So now we have requirements, we have evaluation criteria, and our requirements are prioritized. The rest, To describe it is very simple. To do it was a little more difficult. But regardless of whether we had one or more documents, we just made a column in the spreadsheet with each of the documents at the top, and we assessed each one against the set of questions. Whether it was one document, so we had one cell, or whether we had a variety of documents and we had a whole row of results. Each cell captured where in the document, we tried to be as evidence-based as we could. We captured where in the document those questions were answered, and then we rolled the results up, identified the gaps, identified the associated risk, and that's what we communicated back to the program. Keeping in mind we had to be as flexible as we could because we're used to seeing requirements in a certain way. We're used to seeing certain types of information in certain plans, and mostly we were looking at a whole stack of plans. When that wasn't there, we had to ask a few questions. We may have had to ask for more documents. We had to ask for clarification. We did what we could to be able to answer those questions, and then the end result was, here are the gaps, here are the associated risks, and then the program took those and ran them through their review boards and sent them back to the provider. So that solution didn't matter what we got or how the provider was working. It did give us a consistent way of assessing what we got from the providers, regardless of how they were generating that information. Now, as means of transition, I mentioned that the commercial crew program chose to use a small set of documents for not only requirements, but for governing the program. This is it. This is a set of documents. These are the rules that the commercial crew program works under. You notice that for the most part, for our purposes today, there are two requirements documents. There's what we like to refer to by the numbers, 1130, which is essentially the technical requirements for the transportation system. And the 50808 document is for anybody who's going to be interfacing with the International Space Station inside their little sphere of their little bubble, as well as, if you're going to be delivering cargo or delivering people, you've got to meet those requirements for the International Space Station. So essentially there were two requirements documents. That was it. Now, yes, they do point to other standards. They do point to other things. They also talk about which standards alternates could be provided for. So this is the set of documentation that was a very simple set of documents for the commercial crew program. And at this point, you've heard plenty from me. I'm going to turn this over to Chad.
Thank you. So the second challenge we're going to discuss with you today was just the magnitude of the information that we were dealing with. Kathy already mentioned we have 3 complete solutions from 3 different providers. These are very large and very complex systems. We were launching humans into space. And these solutions include the spacecraft, launch vehicle, ground systems, and as Kathy mentioned, unique processes, development processes that we had to become familiar with and adapt to the commercial crew environment. Just to give you a feel for the size, I led the hazard analysis review effort. We reviewed 115 unique hazard reports, and this was a subset of the total number of hazard reports, and these were delivered multiple times. We were involved with several milestones through the CC-ICAP phase, as well as twice through CPC. So a large number of artifacts just from the hazard perspective, and compound that with the alternate standards. And our team, we were 3.5 people, up to 5 at a peak, but relatively small to deal with that amount of information. And just to come up to speed with this, we were a little bit late to the party, starting early CPC and mid CC-ICAP. So we had a large pile of design information to identify and get familiar with in order to provide some value for our hazard reviews. We approached this like you would any other large effort. We scoped and prioritized. As Kathy mentioned, our scope included crew safety. FAA would cover the public safety and people on the ground. We also focused our efforts on where software showed up. That's why we were supporting CCP. So anything that software could influence or touch, that was pretty much in scope for us. But that did at least reduce the amount of information that we were looking at. We also identified minimum success criteria as well as stretch goals. We pretty much, anything we were assigned, that was minimum success for us. We wanted to make sure anything that our point of contact was assigned had good coverage. But we also saw a need that for additional activities that we'd like to get to. So we kind of identified those as stretch goals and pursued those at, I kind of chuckle at the valleys of the effort during this time, but we filled those in as as much as we could. We also leveraged the concept of a technical reference from the IV&V office. As Kathy mentioned, we're the SNMA support office, one of the two technical offices. But we didn't follow the complete guidelines that IV&V has generated for the technical reference, but we borrowed the concept, identified design information that we were going to leverage for our teams, and stored those so we could flip back and forth through our reviews. When we were looking at one provider, here's our tech reference for there. When we're looking at the second one, we had to kind of flush our brains and come back up to speed with what system we were looking at. And we also have we are generating a lot of information to match what we're receiving. So we implemented the use of an issue tracking system as well as a task tracking system within JIRA. Fairly robust, helps us manage those 700 comments throughout these phases, and was critical to our success, just to be able to generate outputs when needed on the fly. Our third challenge, I guess, would be keeping the data separate. This is a very competitive environment, and it's growing. And in the commercial space, their proprietary data is really the source of their profits. They protect that very closely. So a slip up from NASA, not only would it tarnish our working relationship, but it could have severe cost and schedule impacts too when it comes to protests after contract award. So any data breach we had could really be impactful. So there's lots of emphasis. In fact, when we were first getting started, that was a big point of concern, and we, to address that, we assigned points of contact. That was critical early on to keep things, at least the image of separate, even though we are a very small team and we could not firewall people completely and assign one analyst for one provider. That was not feasible. We had many opportunities to slip up. We had lots of reviews, and any kind of comment or finding that we generated, if it had a piece of information that shouldn't be exported, that's one opportunity. The others, probably more likely, would be the direct interactions we had with our providers. When we are participating live with the partners, we have to be on our feet and be prepared. Letting something slip about an assumption we had about a design could really slip up. They might not know where the design information came from, but it's still a breach. We followed the commercial crew guidance for only storing commercial artifacts on their repository. Our team had to be granted permissions at the individual level for these documents on SharePoint, their repository. We did not store any documents on our own secure network, although we did have many work artifacts that we generated that we did have to store. Those are all behind encrypted, secure locations with the appropriate SBU and proprietary labels. As I said, and we also kept all work products separate. We didn't have a work product or a template or a spreadsheet that contained findings from more than one provider. It's very tempting to just add another tab and say, here, I've got all my software engineering review in one location, but we have different folders, with different permissions if needed. Fortunately, we haven't had to split our team up with permissions internally, but we have the structure for that. As Kathy mentioned, we are operating under different contract vehicles with each different rules. Kathy mentioned the Space Act agreement is more of a partnership improving the product. It was frowned upon to point out flaws. We had to communicate with recommendations and lessons learned. You could not be directive under a Space Act agreement. However, under contract, you can be more directive. You are communicating issues. And so what we did in our issue management system, when applicable, we would describe a finding both as an issue and a recommendation. Sometimes it was a bit of a stretch, and in that case, we wouldn't. But where feasible, we would document the finding both ways. In that way, we could, on the fly, generate exactly what we needed to meet the contract rules whenever asked. This really helped. We didn't have to do any manual adjustment before or scrub before our findings were delivered. And to further complicate things, we dealt with, I think it was only one blackout period, but we had a blackout period to deal with. And as the next challenge, you'll see these phases are operating in parallel, concurrently. So we have a blackout period for one, although we still have to interact with the provider under the CCI cap. So there were very strict rules. We were very careful. When we were in direct communication, we would often ask clarification questions rather than point out an issue or a finding. That way, we were trying to lead them to the answer that or the finding that we had identified. And JIRA again helped us with the managing the rules. Like I said, we had fields for both recommendation and issue that we leveraged. And all of our content went through a rigorous internal review process. I think we had 2 review levels internally, and when we delivered, they all go through our point of contact, who then reviewed, made sure the rules were okay, and then they were submitted under CCP's peer review process. So these were very well vetted before they ever reached the provider. And like I said, these phases were running concurrently. And what really complicated things was that the development lifecycle maturity for these milestones associated with these phases may not be in line. We may be dealing with a PDR level maturity under CPC when CCI cap is already progressing near CDR. So we might be getting documents that has an older revision than what we've already seen under CCI cap. So that was tricky. We documented our findings as best we could. Our findings existed outside of these phases. So we did not define a brand new comment for one phase and another. These comments existed throughout, and under one phase we might get multiple deliveries of the same artifact. So again, we're not going to write a new finding for a new revision. We verify past comments. So that helped us keep track. I think it was tricky for the providers to keep track. When we've submitted a comment, they might say it's already addressed in the new revision, and we kind of have to say, we know, but we still have to deliver it. I think, yep. Our work products, our spreadsheets, Kathy mentioned a column for each artifact that might all be used to roll up a sum total or sum coverage of a requirement. Well, we also used that same work artifact to capture the new revisions. So we had the complete document history in one location for all the documents assessed for our requirement or the intent, or to match our criteria. That really helped us keep everything concise as possible with all this information that we were dealing with. And as I said, we tailored the deliveries from our issue management system based on the rules of each provider. So since we had both recommendations and issues defined, and these phases are running concurrently, it's just a matter of clicking a button, or clicking the right button to get the information we need. And the last bullet I hadn't covered yet was we focused assessments on the changes where possible. We leveraged tools like Beyond Compare, but often the changes were so overwhelming that a fresh review made more sense than trying to figure out the changes and focus there. So we did what we could to minimize work. Here's just a graphic of the schedule. There's some changes, but overall it's fairly accurate. And you can see the significant overlap between CCI cap and CPC. And that's right where we stepped in, so we were right in the middle of it. So one thing we hadn't covered too much of was the multitude of stakeholders that we're dealing with. Now, Kathy already mentioned the FAA, and of course the commercial providers that we're dealing with. Those are kind of external to NASA, but even internal to NASA, we have reach back support across the agency with multiple disciplines and perspectives. And many of them are critical to include in our assessments. Mainly, our internal interfaces or stakeholders was safety and mission assurance for commercial crew, engineering, they called them SC&I, I think it's systems engineering and integration, and the International Space Station. So when we had to make a decision or a NASA view on a topic, those were the three stakeholders that we had to include. So I've got an example here, common mode software. There was different perspectives or different views on whether software should apply, or the failure tolerance requirement applied to software. There were some who didn't believe that software should have to adhere to a two failure tolerant requirement. That means I have to install 3 different pieces of software developed independently. And so it was a big challenge to kind of get everybody's perspectives in a line internal to NASA. And NASA, as you know, have some other internal projects or programs, MPCV, SLS, and GSDO, that are running internal that are working from a very similar set of requirements. So it really looks bad if NASA internally interprets requirements multiple different ways. Very big challenge to try to get everybody on the same page. For that example, we, along with our point of contact, documented a thought paper that kind of clearly outlined our interpretation of software and as it relates to failure tolerance. We were able to get buy-in from ISS and engineering before we had to communicate to our providers. I think that was a pretty big decision to make. It was applicable, in case you're curious. Beyond our internal focus for including stakeholders where we saw fit, there was a big emphasis, especially from our point of contact, on establishing and maintaining communications. We were in West Virginia. Our point of contact is in Kennedy. A lot of work is also coming out of Johnson, let alone the locations from our providers, which Colorado, California, and I think Texas as well. So we were able, fortunately, to probably meet face-to-face at least 3 or 4 times a year with our point of contact that really helped keep things aligned. Another bullet I have here for solutions is we proactively sought out work. We did not wait for things to be assigned when possible. Anything that we thought, hey, that might need a software assurance perspective, we pointed it out to our point of contact and also asked the question of the artifact or whoever owned that review. Vice versa, when we were reviewing something that we thought, hey, space station needs to look at this or engineering needs to see this, we would also initiate that conversation. And proactively identifying that gave us enough time to get those perspectives. Although that wasn't perfect, there were several times that artifacts went to a board and a board asked, well, what does engineering think? Or what did software assurance think? So that kind of was a source of many very short turnaround items for us. So still working through that one. And the last bullet there, our predefined criteria really helped us communicate out how we were looking at things, so others knew what perspective we were coming through, and also kept us in line and kept a consistent analysis for each provider and a similar rigor to keep things fair across the providers. And this is just a graphic that shows the distribution of some of the stakeholders. I'm sorry. It's a little out of date. You can see we don't even show up there in West Virginia, and we've got Blue Origin that is no longer a funded partner, but just a overview geographically. So that concludes the 6 main challenges. We had a couple others that are worth note that I'll cover here quickly. But after that, we're going to open it up to questions. The first bullet was kind of an interesting one. Commercial crew asked for reviews to make sure they have met the intent of our alternate standard. Let's use 7150, the software engineering standard for an example, as well as have they identified all the hazards and have they been mitigated appropriately? Well, our comments had to be targeted to an artifact, and as Kathy mentioned, we got a stack of artifacts to assess the 7150 standard. So we had a gap from the 7150 coverage that we really couldn't levy against a software development plan or test plan because it's really not appropriate. But where would we apply that comment? SharePoint that was used to house the comments didn't have a spot to say general comments or overview or how well did they meet the intent overall. The same way with hazards, we had to provide feedback according to the artifact to this hazard and that. There was no place for us to formally input comments to say, hey, they missed this hazard. That's a pretty big deal. So in order to kind of address that, we recognized the program's real need, even though the framework was not there to support it. We provided summary reports that gave our perspective on those larger overviews. The second one I've got there is the limited processes and templates. We did have to generate our own internally. As Kathy mentioned, there wasn't much guidance on how to assess intent for NASA standards, although I think the templates that we set up and processes internally worked out well for us. And the last one, of course, we were dealing with short time frames. We often did not get the required 30 days notice before our comments were due. So that was a challenge, but you deal with that as any other. Prioritize and do what you can. I believe that concludes our presentation. We encourage any questions you have. Given time, I know you're probably hungry.
We'll take as many questions as people's stomachs will allow, but I do have a comment to share from the web. Norm Peters indicates as CCP's SNMA point of contact, I much appreciate the support the SSO has provided. I could not have asked for a more professional team and looked forward to working with them as we move into the next phase of the program. A shameless plug, if anyone needs this type of support, strongly consider the IV&V SSO folks. So,
thank you, Norm.
and we will take questions in the room and online.
Hi, Kathy.
Hello.
Good to see you again. I'm glad you brought up the prioritizing of the requirements on that one project. It is actually something, I think it was Task and Bailey's group was in here the other day with their system risk assessment. And sometimes what we do in my field is called a functional risk assessment. We will take the requirements and step through and weight each one, pulling the critical ones out, looking at critical requirements, critical features, and then stepping through and rating each one. So I'm glad you mentioned that because it ties in exactly with where I was going yesterday, but I'm not quite sure if I got there, but you got there today with it, so thank you.
Yeah.
And then I like what he brought up with, and I think it was a challenge when it came up in Neil's presentation or one of the other ones the other day is how do we get everybody kind of on the same page, but keep the innovation and keep the thinking. In other words, we don't, like Star Wars, you don't want a bunch of stormtroopers where everybody's using the same languages, the same tools, and moving in the same direction. You definitely don't want that. But on the other hand, it's tough to be effective and efficient when you have everybody in their own little creative pockets and groups. And the communication isn't there and the sharing isn't there. So I think in his talk where you could see the different tools and what other groups have done, when your group is in the startup phase, you could look in and go from there. I think that's like a couple good steps, but I see, like I said, and I've seen this in other fields though too, the same challenge. How do you keep the innovation, but kind of streamline it in a way? So, thank you.
You're welcome.
My general question is on your team size. I got the impression from your presentation only 3 to 5 people are working in this. It seems like it should be much larger than that.
Yeah, we agree.
Yeah, we'd love it to be larger.
But so I assume you're not looking at actual code or anything like this at this stage. It's just documents that the provider says that we're
At this point, that's correct. hazard reports. We will be moving into more of the design and perhaps some code. But again, this is company proprietary, so there may be restrictions on how much that we actually get to see. But the CCTCAP, this phase that we're about to support, we'll get more into more of the, little less of the process, a little more of the design and the development pieces.
And the implementation, I assume.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the desire is to enter TCAP right at CDR level maturity, although I don't think all the providers are there. But yeah.
I've got a question. Can you share with us what the biggest difference you see between the way NASA handles safety critical software and what you saw with these different companies? I don't know if you can share that or not, but if you could share one or two things, that would be helpful.
Well, yeah, we will remain vague, but I think as a general perspective, the commercial providers have a tendency sometimes, not all, to view some of the safety critical aspects as more documentation exercises. They have confidence that they're going to do the right thing, and NASA, I think it's an evolution thing where we've had some accidents. We understand the importance of this, and I'm not sure that our commercial providers have the same sensitivity or acknowledgement of the importance. So it's a little bit of a fight to get them to meet the complete intent of the NASA safety critical software requirements.
Okay, so would you say that they're saying the right things and parroting back that they're going to do certain things, but when you go to look and verify that, you either can't see it or you're not finding it in what they give you? Is that true?
In some cases, yes. In others, it's a blatant, I don't think that's important, or we're safe, our processes will result in a safe product, and we meet most of the intent, trust us.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Or it's built into our engineering processes. We're not going to write separate safety documentation to show you that. We get those kinds of answers as well.
Yeah, good question.
Do you have any insight into who's going to decide who's going to provide IV&V for this project, and when the decision might be made?
Yeah, I think we're interested in that answer as well. We know that there have been multiple options, ranging from we do the IV&V to IV&V will be reviewed by NASA IV&V. Unfortunately, we don't have the answer. We know that at least one provider does have a IV&V provider contracted. So I think the answer is going to range. And no, don't have the answer yet. Sorry.
Right. Yeah, we know everyone here is anxious to hear what role this facility will play in the IV&V elements of commercial crew. But still more open questions than we have answers at this point. We're still asking the questions. Don't get us wrong. We're still asking, and we're feeding that information when we can. But the answers just haven't been provided yet.
Yeah, and anytime we see any mention of IV&V, we're sure to point it out and feed that up through our management to get over to your office for sure. Thank you.
Is that it? Okay.
Thank you, everybody. So we will resume at 1 o'clock with